Fans, it's me, Candace, coming at you live from the bookstore for tonight's author event. And I always say I'm excited, but I'm so excited for this event tonight because I have two amazing authors. And I was just telling Lee that this is like the most non-binary event I've ever had, and I'm very personally excited about that. So welcome. Tonight we are talking about Summer Sons, this book right here by Lee Mandelo. And Lee is a writer, critic, and occasional editor whose fields of interest include speculative and queer fiction, especially when the two coincide, our favorite kind. They have been a past nominee for various awards, including the Nebula, the Lambda, and the Hugo. Their work can be found in magazines such as Tor.com, Uncanny Magazine, Clark's World, and Nightmare. Aside from a brief stint overseas learning to speak Scouse, I think, so we'll have to talk about that, Mandelo has spent their life ranging across Kentucky, currently living in Lexington and pursuing a PhD at the University of Kentucky. And Lee will be in conversation with one of our favorites, one of my personal favorites, Annalee Newitz, who wrote The Future of Another Timeline, which is the book I have here because it's my personal favorite to recommend. But they also have lots of other books, including Four Lost Cities, which is a nonfiction book that you should all buy as well. But Annalee is an American journalist, editor, and author of fiction and nonfiction. They are the recipient of a Knight Science Journalism Fellowship from MIT. They've written for Popular Science, The New Yorker, and The Washington Post. They founded the sci-fi website IO9 and served as editor-in-chief from 2008 to 2015, and then became editor-in-chief at Gizmodo and tech culture editor at Ars Technica. Sorry if I can speak today. Their book Scatter, Adapt, and Remember: How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction was nominated for the LA Times Book Prize in Science. And their first novel, Autonomous, which is also here on the shelf, I don't know if you can see it, won a Lambda Award. So welcome to both of you. I am so excited to have you all here. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Hi.
Go away now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Candace. We both love Tubby and Coos, so it's a delight to be here. And I'm super honored to be able to talk to Lee. It's really exciting to read a book, like completely get sucked into it, and then be able to be like, I will now ask the author all my questions. So this is really just like, a super great moment for me. So I'm gonna ask Lee all the questions I want to ask. And then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So if you have questions, you can put them into chat, I think, and then we'll ask them and we'll talk about your questions too. So okay. I was looking at the very long, glowing reviews of your book on Amazon, Lee, which is pretty awesome. Yeah. And one of the people talked about how this book, Summer Sons, introduced them to this subculture of dark academia, which is an aesthetic which is kind of about, people who are obsessed with reading and kind of, like 18th and 19th century scholarship, but also dark academia is kind of like the genre for people who do mad science, but like in the humanities. So it's like if you have like mad humanities or something. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that and that setting and like why you chose to have these mad humanities students be kind of your protagonists.
Yeah. So one of the like quips I've been giving out with this is that all academia is dark academia. Like functionally, that is the structure of the system. Like sometimes we play it up more and it's a little more extreme, but the core content is there, particularly with the mad humanities, as you say, which I also am going to steal now, in terms of how academia is so very invested in a performance of class in a particular way, and if particularly in the South, a performance of racialized class dynamics, that as someone who did grad school more than once, I left and came back. That was part of coming back to a PhD, was really working through what went wrong the first time, which shows up in this book, a lot of it, the sense of what you want to be doing as someone who just wants to read books and talk about how cool they are and critique culture and make a difference. And then you become enmeshed in a system that is very much not about those things in some very practical ways, encountering generational wealth for the first time, that sort of stuff, and becoming very aware that there's a whole world out there that you really have no part of and have tried to enter but don't necessarily fit in. And I enjoy Andrew as a protagonist, even though he stresses me out deeply because he's bad at school. And I can't deal with the way that he behaves in the book. And I know that's been one of the most common complaints / love things from academic friends, is that he just doesn't go to class. Sometimes he's not paying attention to like his graduate work. And that stresses most people out more than like the murder, I think, in the book, is that why isn't he doing his homework? Which I think also shows who we all are as people a little bit.
Yeah, that's so funny, because I remember thinking like, because there's a certain moment in the book where he finally kind of explains to us like, I'm not really in it to get anywhere in academia. I just came here for this guy and I want to solve his murder. And he's much more of a kind of detective character in a sense. But yeah, it is anxiety provoking, because I'm like, dude, you could just get in your car and go to the seminar. Like, come on, just sleep through it. It's fine. The other thing that's cool about setting this book in academia, because it is a book about history and it's about texts and storytelling, it's about folklore and sort of who gets to tell stories, is that, because so many of these characters are academics, they get to have really like meta conversations about what's happening in the book. And in fact, they even talk about the book's tropes, and we see them, taking them apart. And I wonder if you could talk about that, the process of writing that, and kind of, were you thinking of that as like a meta space where you could kind of slyly comment, or was it more just like these characters are academics and that's just kind of how they are?
Yes, so it is a meta space, which is probably an unsurprising answer from an academic in a particular way. That's part of, I think, the fun of doing a contemporary Southern Gothic, is that it's already the Southern Gothic, a mashup genre. It's sort of got genealogy all over the place. We're drawing from Gothics on the continent in Europe and then making them weirder and more upsetting, and often drawing in the legacies of slavery and history in the South, looking at all of these things through a uniquely American lens. So that's where I started with wanting to do something like that. But if you set it in the academy, everyone in the book will be aware of the book that they're in a particular way, because this is the work they do, as you pointed that out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also a habit of how I write fiction as like a practicing academic, tends to be a lot of research reading, even if it doesn't all make it into the book. So there's a way to do commentary almost on the things that I am studying personally or find interesting through the mouths of some of these people, and also commentary that they themselves can't provide on their own actions. Like, as a writer, the text is doing something different than the characters think it's doing at several points in the book. And that's the fun part for me, to speak almost through the prose to the audience, to be like, well, they're doing this, but you should know that's not great. And here's why. Like that sort of fun play with the what tiers is the text doing the story on. And I do enjoy that part.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the characters are kind of studying themselves. Essentially, I mean, they're researching their own history, which is also the history of the South. And that's, I mean, the South becomes a major character in this. I mean, as you said, the Gothic kind of has its roots in Europe, but then it comes to the States and it kind of settles in the South, although it takes a little trip through New England on the way. I don't know if you've read Wieland or Memoirs of Carwin, which is like the first American Gothic. Anyway, that's like a literature nerd moment. That's a side, that's a footnote. But anyway, so I wondered if you could talk about setting it in Tennessee, why you decided on Tennessee versus, say, Kentucky. Was it part of your own research that you had been doing as an academic? And also, why does it need to be in the South? Like all of those questions, like just talk about the South.
Yeah. So I'm from here, and is the way of many people being from, in my case, rural Kentucky, so kind of Appalachian South, which is not fully one thing or the other in a way that can be culturally very interesting depending on where your family's from. Mine are mostly from the Deep South. And I think that growing up, I very much came to understand that some of their cultural habits that like are part of one's DNA were also really, really steeped in some deeply problematic history and opinions and approaches. So I think part of going into academia and studying those things and then wanting to work through writing about them was dealing with how do we address a history that we very much want to ignore in the US about the South? And I do think kind of deeply, this is an argument I'll make, that the South is the pattern for the rest of the country in a lot of ways that we are dismissive of politically, particularly sometimes in like internet leftist discourse of like, oh, the South, those red states. Well, they're extremely diverse states where most social movements begin and flourish from. And it's hard to live here if you are one of those types of people. So that's part of it, was thinking about, like, I live here and I've left and come back. And I think it's politically important to be engaged with what made me a human, but also all the communities that I am part of and have been part of here. Particularly queer men in the South have a very different experience, I think, of queer masculinity, which is what a lot of this book is about too, is working through my own experiences with that and growing up dealing with what it means to join the team on masculinity. And some of it's quite bad, and really processing through your own behavior as like a queer man in the South, what you tried to be or patterned yourself on. So that's also in the book's DNA. And then continuing on, Tennessee is because of Vanderbilt. So I didn't go to Vanderbilt, but I had a sort of roommate who did go to Vanderbilt and was a lacrosse boy and had rich parents and was everything people in the audience are wincing and imagining. And I learned a lot about the politics of Vanderbilt from that person while I was in a graduate program at University of Louisville, round one, and seeing how particularly race at universities in the South really plays into who gets funding, who gets attention, who has scholars to work with, who doesn't have people to work with, whose work is valued. And I still think that that's a huge active problem, like at all universities. But I think there's a particular legacy with a lot of the Southern institutions, the Ivies of the South, where their money has literally generationally come from the legacy of slavery in a way that we don't deal with like at all in the institution. Mm-hmm. So that too is in the DNA of the book as things to work through and looking at maybe not how to recuperate masculinity, but how to make it something better than it is, to almost hold it to account, be a little hopeful about what you could do as someone in the system of academia who is a white guy of some flavor and variety.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's because universities are part of this not ancient, but centuries long history in the South. And so it is they're intertwined with this history of gender roles and racial hierarchies and genocide and all that stuff that we have left over from history that's still haunting us. So, okay, let's talk about boys, because that's important. And I love, there's so many boys in this book. I love pretty much all of them. I love all of their relationships. I love that we get such a broad spectrum of different kinds of relationships. We have like very toxic masculinity, very non-toxic masculinity. We have like cis guys, trans guys. We have a good poly group, a bad poly group. Like I'm just going to make all these lists. I was like telling a friend the other day, I was like, this is the first book I've ever read where you have more than one polyamorous group and like are able to have a bad one and a good one as a result. I was like, wow, okay, so this just has everything. So to the question about masculinity, I wonder if you could I want you to just sort of talk a little bit about Andrew's journey as a protagonist and also how you were thinking about that transition from bromance to romance as you were thinking about his character.
Yeah. So here's where I draw in the slight autobiographical background of the novel that I have said in a few interviews, where like I began writing this while dating my straight identified best friend in grad school, which went poorly for everyone involved, all of our friends and us. No one had a good time with that. And I started writing the book while working through whether I was going to continue like being in this relationship in these ways. So despite having been aware of my queerness for a very long time, like moving into that space of masculinity in college and identifying in those ways and dating men like as a guy of some flavor opened up a whole new realm of problems that I had not encountered before, and how men interact with each other very differently and problematic ways sometimes. So I think a lot of Andrew's journey is sort of through a mirror refracted, kind of looking at what does it mean to not know yourself, but to be so deeply, deeply who you are despite that? Because I think the text makes it fairly obvious in how he pays attention to men, like from page 1, how he notices bodies and only other men, and doesn't really pay attention to women, which is a problem culturally and socially in many ways.
Well, also at one point, a character says to him, like, what? You're not gay? And that was me. I was like, wait, what? Like, I really thought he was just like, just a homo. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh no.
He's on a journey.
And it feels very realistic too. Like we're sort of seeing it from outside, but also from his perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just him working through some of that in a way is, I think, a way of looking at how a lot of queer boys in my life in the South had to come sort of the long way to figuring out what was going on with how intense their relationships are with men, because it, like, homosocial relationships are such a thing. Like, I've known many, 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 many men who love deeply their best male friends in ways that they don't give that emotional intensity to anyone else in their lives, including like wives and girlfriends, etc. sometimes. And that's not really examined most of the time. But it's hard when you are going to become a queer person openly to work through like, oh, am I in love with my best friend? Have I always been in love with my best friend? Are all of my relationships actually this? And that is really a journey I think many of us can relate to.
Yeah, it's funny because along the way, as Andrew is kind of floating between this very buttoned down or buttoned up, like high class world of academia, which has its own masculinity issues, and then the world of cars and racing, where it's very like, these are good old boys. You know, they kind of fit the stereotype of good old boys. Sometimes they kind of don't. And it feels like, I know you were saying that you weren't trying to rehabilitate these kinds of guys, but there's a way in which, especially with the character of Sam, we kind of do see that kind of guy being rehabilitated. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, I think what I want is to be hopeful about the possibility of what masculinity can do and look like and be, and that maybe men can be decent independently and with each other and with other people without always having to get rid of some of the ideas about what masculinity might mean to them based on culture and geography and their own upbringing. Like, what does it mean for a guy like Sam, who is in every way you look at him when he first shows up, like a good old boy, to actually be someone who deeply cares about other people and is invested in his community and like wants to be a decent person and is willing to communicate about it. And I think that has been a common response, is the shock arc of people who are like, I hate that guy, then being like, I am ride or die for that man now. And like, is Sam a real person? Maybe he's out there somewhere, but he's an investment in the hope of a person that like maybe we could create with ourselves doing some of that work. But I think the contrast of him, particularly with Riley, his cousin, and these things is part of that work also. It's like a reparative reading rather than a rehabilitative reading. That's going to be my nerd answer to that. It's fixing something, hopefully, for the future, rather than being like, this is fine, actually.
Oh, man, I love that so much. Like, because I think there is so much about traditional masculinity that is worth salvaging. Like, there's these ideas of honor and like, and having like a strong community with your friends and all kinds of other stuff that we learn from like sword and sandal movies and like, medieval movies with sword, like anything where there's swords and guys, like there's always a lot of this kind of beautiful connection between men that is pure, like you're saying. Okay, so I want to talk to you about cars because I was just talking about swords, and I feel like in this novel, cars are swords, in a sense. Like,
yeah,
it's like, no, we're not gladiators. We're car riders. Okay, so I want to know everything about how you went about bringing cars into this story. Are you a car buff? Did you like just geek out about cars? Like, where did the Fast and the Furious feeling come from?
Yes. So having always been into cars since forever, like that's part of it. But there's almost a two-part answer to this. And the first part, I'll start with the biographical fun car stuff, which is that my high school group of friends were mostly car boys and in Bullitt County, Kentucky. So it wasn't like nice cars. It was cars that they worked on and built things in. And we had a good time. There wasn't a lot else to do. Like that is how you spend your time. And then going from there, even in college, etc., I like to drive fast. I won't say irresponsibly because I find it responsible and practiced. But, other people could have different opinions about that in their time. And had relationships again with lots of other car boys. So that was just a natural part of life for me. And I just like them. I think they're sexy and cool. Like they're neat machines that you can just take apart and put back together. I had a roommate for a long time who took an old like Mazda pickup truck and then put a very nice engine in it. So it was just a very beater looking old Mazda that could go very fast. And he did that all himself and it was lovely. So that's that half. Mm-hmm. And the other half of the question is that Carl is an excellent editor at Tor.com. And in the initial drafts of the book, I had a little bit throttled back on the level of detail on the racing in the cars because I was worried.
You throttled back?
Uh-huh. On purpose.
Put the brakes on
it. Yeah. I was just naturally worried that most of my beloved audience would not share the feelings or experiences that I have about cars and did not want to overwhelm, much like a long food scene, which is great if you love food. But if you're not into food, you see all the tweets that are like, why has he been talking about this banquet for 30 pages? But in reading it, Carl's answer was basically, no, this is deeply horny. You really like it and it's character important. So just do what feels right, like write more of it. And that is what happened. And I think he was right. He's very good at his job.
Yeah, I think it did turn out well. What do you think that the car scenes, what kind of narrative work did you feel like they were doing?
Yes. So there's a couple of tiers of answer on this one. There's a lot of little Easter eggs in the book, I think, as with every book. But the types of cars everyone drives are deeply reflective of their socioeconomic status, what they like, what they think is culturally important, like what kinds of work they like to do on their cars. The main car that Andrew ends up driving, the Hellcat Challenger that was Eddie's, is actually kind of a rag on him because you can just buy that if you're rich. Like no work went into that. He just bought that how it is. And sure, it gets the job done, but he didn't make it, comparative to the rest of the group who predominantly have cars that they worked on, that are older, that have some love invested in them, etc. Like someone has a deliciously purple Fox Body Mustang that I think is beautiful. The boxy ones, they're nice. So there is that level. But then the narrative level, I think, is also a way for Andrew to get out of his skin. Because despite the fact that he feels things very strongly, he's also just miserably depressed for a significant portion of the first part of the book, having lost his very close friend / question mark person, but that's the first time he really is able to experience a strong emotion again. And I think as a writer in general, I'm very interested in affect and feeling and how we do things with our bodies. And that's a very visceral experience to write about. Like it's a little risky. You've got the speed. You're scared, even if you're having a good time. There's a lot of mix of terror and fun in there. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to sort of finish up by going back to thinking about Tennessee a little bit, was how you feel like representations of the South are often poor, I guess. That wasn't your words. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but and I mean, representations of the South are partly poor because, as you said, like people are kind of burying history that's really integral to what made the region what it is. But the other thing is that a lot of those representations are poor because they're coming from the North. And there's this stereotype that like everybody in the South is dumb. They are good old boys. They are intolerant. And, you know, I think people from the North who aren't familiar with the culture would be shocked to see like, oh, there's a thriving queer culture happening, you know? And so I wonder, so I guess this started as a comment, but the question is just, what did you feel like you wanted to do in thinking through the diversity of the South? And did you ever feel like you were sort of writing a Dear Northern People kind of book? Like, hello, you know, this is how it really is?
Yeah. I definitely think that's like a through-going concern in a lot of the work that I do fiction-wise and non-fiction-wise, is thinking about it is like that here, though. Like it's a deeply diverse place in the South. There is a huge queer community. As you said, Atlanta is one of the queer hotspots on the planet. And that's not something that I think the average person who is not from here, hasn't traveled here, is aware of in that way. Also, that in terms of like segregation in cities, like a lot of southern cities are increasingly less segregated than northern cities because of like movement patterns and economics and all the stuff we can just scooch off to the side. But like I wanted to write a story that reflected how I had experienced like living in the South, and the friends that I had made and the relationships that I'd had are all sort of what builds that book. Is that it is entirely possible to have a group of predominantly queer, mostly mask presenting friends who all just hang out and maybe go to school and maybe act up and make a ruckus at night and drink a little too much and smoke too much weed, but also want to talk about Foucault. Like those are the people that I hung out with, and that was real. And to your point, the comment, yeah, like I don't think people associate that with the South, but I think it's a thriving place down here. We have a lot to do culturally that I think is neat and that I am invested in. I do think there's been an uptick in more writers coming from Appalachia in the South over the past decade or so. And I do think some of it is from spite. In a way. Like, you know, you hear the hillbilly elegy of it all, like, fuck that guy, you know, it's terrible. And people do work well from spite. And you're like, that's not what it's like to live here. That's not accurate. Like, that is not how it is to be poor, like in Appalachia. It's way more communal than that, for one thing. But yeah, so I was kind of working on that. I got a little heated for a second there. Sorry.
Yeah, I think as you should. I think that's part of the power of this book, is that it's just like, look, this is how it is. And there's no, moment of, oh, well, now we must wring our hands about how terrible and sad it is for these people to be here in this dark and awful place. And it's just like, no, it's just like, we're here and we're fucking around. Yeah, like you said, we're driving our fast cars and making a ruckus. So that was one of the many joys of this book. Okay, so I think that we're just waiting for questions from the audience. I have many more questions, so I can keep chatting, but if you want to ask a question, you can put them into the chat for the QA, as this helpful giant green banner says. So I have more writing questions for you, because I know that you've written both nonfiction and fiction. And in fact, you first came to my attention as a nonfiction writer, and you're writing, criticism of science fiction. And I wondered, were you writing fiction all along, or like did one start and the other one kind of came in later, or how did that evolution happen?
Yeah, so it's been fiction all along in the background in a sense, but I wrote more short fiction. And I know everyone's different on this, but between like academic writing like popular criticism and fiction, I can't do them at the same time. like there's almost a moment in a season for each thing where I'm focusing more on that way of thinking and that style of prose. And I do think they all feed into each other, which is very fun for me. So it'll be like, I'm working on an academic project. I'm reading all this research and pouring theory into my brain and being sad because most of it's not like a nice thing for the most part. Some of it is, some of it's good, but a lot of it is bad vibes only. Like, and then,
wait, so what are you subtweeting here? Like, what's the bad vibes? Academic writing or?
No, I just, been reading a lot of Lauren Berlant and stuff lately, which they're brilliant and it's wonderful, but you don't always leave cultural criticism about the US contemporarily feeling good. Like, I try to maintain a balance. I have my Jose Munoz tattoo for the remember futurity. We got stuff. We can build it. But sometimes when you're in the muck, you get a little, oh no.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah. But from there, that can kind of go into, all right, I wrote the academic bit. I've thought about the almost top down look at it. Now I want to make art about that thing. Because art is where the heart lives for me. I think that's where everything comes back to, is always art making in some sense or another. Lots of visual artist friends wish I could do that. Just consume it instead. It's beautiful. Just enjoy it. And that almost goes in the same tier as the academic work. It all feeds the fiction. Well, I've got all the information. Now I want to make a story out of it or this experience. And then that well runs dry and you write a book. You're I have to do something else for a bit now. And then we make the cycle again. And I do enjoy the end of that, writing popular criticism and reviews and critique a lot, because readers are awesome. I am a reader. We all are. And it's fun to just have conversations about other people's work. I think that's the best part of writing, is reading everyone else's stuff and being that was very cool. I wouldn't have done it exactly like that. And that's neat. And just sort of seeing everyone else's thoughts and patterns and prose habits, and love reading poetry. Can't do it. I love taking ideas from them in terms of how they use language. Poets, thanks.
Do you find that your fiction is more hopeful than your nonfiction? I mean, I was kind of getting that vibe from you, especially when you were just sort of talking about that now, but also when you were talking about how your characters in this novel are a kind of a hopeful view of the future of masculinity.
I think it goes through cycles that are culturally mediated, as it were. The novella coming out from Tor next year, 2023, is deeply bad vibes. And I say that lovingly. It's about neoliberalism and science and bad ethical practice and a failing marriage. And I wrote it in the first 2 months of the pandemic, in a burst, which doesn't usually happen for me. So that one wasn't positive necessarily. But then my dissertation work is on queer transmasculinity and public sex cultures and how we all have a good time communally together, because I read L.H. Stallings' Dirty South Manifesto. Plug for that book. It's phenomenal. And it was just a book looking at how cool, horny pop culture is a way of doing sexual resistance in the South that makes us all better. And that was inspiring. And I wanted to roll with that kind of vibe. So both.
Yeah. So wait, when are we going to get our horny orgy novel out of you, or novella? Where's that research going?
Well, give that approximately 2 years and then we'll see. But actually, there's a vague answer, not quite to this. And I am working on a piece of short fiction inspired by the summer I worked at one of the last porn theaters in the tri-state area in Kentucky. It's about ghosts and a porn theater and liminal spaces, because they are very interesting liminal spaces with the crowds who still come and have been going for 60 years, some of them, to the same kind of places. Wow. Just the old guys still coming. You can learn a lot from them when they're not in the theater.
How old was the theater that you worked at?
It was Metro Station in Louisville. Holler. I'm not sure when it opened. I think it is older than I am.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's just a big old ugly barn.
It's in a barn for real, or just
it's built
shaped
like a
barn?
barn. It is shaped like a barn and painted
Wow.
purple. You can look it up on the Google.
Dang. Yeah, because of course, like early sort of grindhouse films were kind of shown in tents and barns. So if you're gonna make a theater, like make it look like a barn so it feels homey, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's what you're used to. So I wanted to, I have a bunch more writing questions for you. So you were just mentioning some books that you find inspiring. Were there any inspirations for Summer Sons or books that you were reading that kind of influenced the setting or influenced how you did the characters or even just made you feel good? So you kind of stuck with the mood?
Yeah. So a few texts on this one. I would say Richard Seekin's poetry, which surprises probably precisely no one who's read the book on that one, that was important. Also, Saeed Jones's Prelude to Bruise, poetry-wise. There is a poem in there that's Body in Kentucky Bourbon, I believe is the name of it. I didn't look beforehand. It's close to that. And when I read that one while sort of processing some of the things that go in the book, it hit a certain note. I think that people who write in the audience will get the like, a bell just tolled, and this is something that is really kicking off a thought. Then structurally, got our Shirley Jackson, of course, Haunting of Hill House. We gotta, that's the one, you know, that's how you do it. A little bit of Caitlin Kiernan in there also. The Red Tree, I think, was phenomenal and terrifying. It upset me very deeply, which I say is the highest praise. And I think Hannibal had just started airing when I was first drafting. And that's in there. That's in the DNA, at least in the revision, if not in the initial draft. But I think it had started airing in terms of the energy, the vibes, as it were. And the last...
Go ahead.
I was going to say the last bit is Ocean Vuong's Unearthed Were Briefly Gorgeous. And that was during revision because I wanted to make the book do more what it was doing. And then read Ocean Vuong's book, and it is just beautiful about queer masculinity and being poor and in a rural area, and like pain, but also beauty. It is hopeful and it's painful and it's hard, but it's also like full of love in a very particular way. And I saw it and was like, wow, all right, nice. Like I want to aim closer to something that looks like that. That's what's up. He's brilliant.
Yeah, no shit. And I love that you were still taking inspiration as you were revising, because I think a lot of people who don't necessarily write all the time don't realize how much work revision is. You know, like revision is a whole thing.
It's a whole other book.
It's a whole exactly. No, it's really true. I'm in a revision process right now, so that's where my brain is. But it's true that you can bring in a whole new sheen. Okay, we're getting some questions now, so let me go through some.
Okay.
A question from Jordan is, Lee, what kind of car do you drive now, and what does it say about your personality, if anything? It doesn't have to say anything.
Yeah, I am currently driving a blue purple-ish color, a little bit of both, Ford Fiesta ST. And it has the sport shift, so I can drive it manual if I so desire, but it's often driven automatic. And it is like a calmer. It is a calm car. It can't do things that I shouldn't be allowed to do now that I'm just more aware of my mortality in my 30s, I think, than I was at age 21. I think that's natural. And I'm trying to be more responsible these days. So I can still have fun in it, but it's more sedate, I think. So maybe it does reflect my personality now.
Here's a question from Libby, which is, can you talk about the differences between fiction and academic writing? And you've also talked about your dissertation, but what is it about and how did it tie into this book?
Okay. So I think the main difference is that fiction is more like an art making process in a way. Like you're thinking about very different things in terms of what your prose is doing. I'm trying to work on you emotionally a lot more in fiction, I guess, which I still do in academic work because they're not really separate. And that is a fun conversation to have with my chair sometimes, being like how I think about approaching research sometimes is about the structure of a story, which doesn't work always. I've sure gotten revision requests on academic work that's like, hey, could you just tell us what this is about in the opening? Despite my years of experience, I just don't sometimes. Like, no, come on a journey with me. And that is not the structure of an academic article. It's come on a journey with me.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, not really.
Can be, I guess, if you're really good at it.
Yeah, if you have tenure.
Yes. Not there yet. But I think the other main difference is the way that a conversation is always happening, I think, in my academic work in the humanities. Like, it is always in conversation very directly as a critique, or a here's how to read this, or did you know this cool, terrible fact about this thing? Maybe not. Or here's how this book teaches us about the world we are contemporarily living in or used to live in, or etc. So it's more looking at it instead of making the thing, but then you can turn it over again and go the other direction and be inspired by your academic work to write some art. They all go together. Also, the second part of the question, publishing is very slow. Very, very, very slow. So I started writing this book about 6 years ago. So it was well before the dissertation thoughts even began, or I came back to academia at all. But there is the through line of that they're all about queer masculinity and horniness and the importance of sexuality in a culture that kind of hates it. That is one of my main driving focuses, is writing sexy stuff because I think it matters. Yeah.
Are you, for your dissertation, are you doing field work, or are you you're reading texts about sexual spaces, or what?
Predominantly textual reading, and some of it looking at like fandom spaces as a public sex culture, because for some reason fandom studies doesn't like to talk about that part, and I would love to talk about that part.
Wow, so, that is super interesting, because it is a public sex space, and it's people sharing that stuff, and people are jacking off to it. I mean, it's not like, oh, but we go to this one space where we jack off. We never do that on the internet, though.
No.
No siree.
Yeah, every tweet response to a porn thread that's just fire emojis, like, that person is jacking off. Like, we all know it, so we're doing it together.
Yeah,
and I want to write about that.
So oh, I love that. Okay, that is awesome. I'm very excited about your dissertation. Yeah. So, all right. Here is a question from Milena, which is, are there any particular poets and or poems that inspired you while you were writing Summer Suns? So let's dive deep into poetry.
Yeah. So I gave the one, which was that Saeed Jones poem. And just fair warning on every one of these, if you look them up, they're a lot. Like, content warning, perhaps, but I don't know. You'll have fun. They're just, prepare yourself on that. And I think the Richard Seekin poem that I use the most is Landscape with Fruit Rot and Millipede. That's the name of it, I think. Titles are my weak spot in remembering them. But it is the one that has a set of lines in it that is something like, what is a ghost but something dead that doesn't know that it's dead? And it's rough. Like, it's a lot, but it's also beautiful in that way. And that's from War of the Foxes. And then Crush is his book that I think gets like internet quoted the most. There's like a Richard Seekin poetry bot, which is fun on Twitter, that I do follow just to get really smacked in the face with some of those lines at random, just randomly throughout the day. And that one is very intensely about, I would say, problematic, difficult, sometimes violent, intense queer masculine relationships. And it's gorgeous and very visceral, which I like. So I think that was in there. And what else? When I grow up, I want to be a list of future possibilities, the Chen Chen book. I hope I didn't mangle that perfect title also. That one feels better. That one's that's a good vibe. It's very good and emotional. Has some hope even in that title there.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question to that, which was, because you were talking about these sort of violence in this poem that you were inspired by. Why do you think that, or why did you want to foreground violence so much in these male relationships in this book? Because there's certain moments where, of course, there has to be violence, but then there's other moments where it's like, well, we're just going to have a scrap, and it's, I wondered why you wanted to do that.
Well, two answers to that. One is just an insight into my psychosexual like makeup as a person. Just like, that's hot. Like just a very simple creature at some tiers. Like no one is surprised by this who's ever looked at my Twitter or books for a single second. I'm like, yes, that's nice. That's good. But on a more professional level, I do think there's something actually kind of beautiful in how we use our bodies together consensually. And I want to look at what that means instead of sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, like going back and reading a bunch of 80s like queer feminist criticism of the anti-sex people like Gail Rubin and etc. has been very inspiring for me recently to think about, well, you can't really get rid of power. We're mostly pretty horny about it as people, even if we don't want to be. So what does it mean to engage with it ethically? And I think that is part of that. And also that sometimes I think pain is a learning tool, like in a useful and interesting way, like playing sports. I like to work out. I've done a lot of CrossFit. Sometimes there's a pretty transcendental experience with like, oh, this is technically uncomfortable or technically painful, but it's also really intimate. And I feel a lot. It feels like a lot. And I think that on a third tier of that, that's also how boys are often only allowed to touch each other. Like that is the only way you're allowed to have intimate contact is through sports or wrestling or other kinds of consensual roughness or roughhousing. And it naturally builds into your sexuality then, I would say, over time, to where you're like chicken and egg, not really sure where this one came from. And I think that is just part of American masculinity in particular, because we're so weird about skin contact and affection and intimacy that it all becomes sort of read through a lens of sometimes violence or tussling or etc. Also, I like punk music and have been in many a pit in my day, and they're beautiful. They're a transcendental experience. So that's in there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, also I was thinking about how, we use, it is partly an American, homoerotic fixation to have that kind of violence, but also there is a kind of darkness to it. And I feel like you're sort of playing with the line between those a little bit. Like, well, what is good violent touch versus bad violent touch? And so there is that, through line in the novel where we're learning the difference between like toxic male relationships and non-toxic ones. And so were you kind of thinking about that? Like, as you planned it out, where you're like, okay, here's going to be my nice violence scene and here's going to be my bad violence scene.
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, I think you can very much read Eddie and Sam against each other, like very almost as mirror images of a kind of man and like how they behave very differently toward Andrew. And I do think that's one of those through lines is like, it's often messy and unpleasant. And the line between this is a good rough touch and one I did not want and ask for is like a razor's edge fine, especially for Andrew, who doesn't really know what he's asking for in a lot of ways. Like he doesn't know what he wants. He's just seeking and sort of throwing darts at a wall. And some of them hit spots that are very bad for him, that he can't quite tell the difference. And I think that's a human, or at least in my experience, like a very human experience of working out. Like, I didn't like that. Thought I did. That wasn't great, actually. Like, that was just a thing that happened. And then trying to move through that into, but this one was good. What's the difference between the pit and a stranger just hitting you on the street? There is a difference. So how do you parse that emotionally? And he is a mess. So he has a hard time. And I think it is hard for people. And there sometimes are, kind of to your point, it's both and. Sometimes they're bad conceptually, and the person is still like, well, that had something for me in it. And that's awful and a lot to work on emotionally. But I wanted it to be in there.
Yeah, for sure. And and showing Andrew kind of trying to figure it out, like, because some people never do, right? No, some people just never realize that there's a difference, and he gets to, which is delightful. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then there's a final question that we have from the audience. So I'm still my brain is still stuck on this idea of Sam and Andrew as these imaginary future men, which makes me so happy. And I wonder if you could, maybe putting on your cultural critic hat for a second, think with here it is. It's invisible, or maybe it's made of tinfoil. Not sure what. I'm wondering what you think needs to happen right now culturally in the US to help bring about more men like this that you imagine, because it's not like we have to yank their souls out and put something else in. It feels like, what would you like to see change, or what kind of political movement do you think could help make this happen?
Yeah, so I teach a lot of gender studies intro courses now, and I would say increasingly there are a lot of like cis, presumably identified as straight currently boys who are taking them, which is different than what I saw a decade ago. And once they're in there, I think a lot of that process of cultural change is being able to approach like, this is not a personal attack, my friend, but here are some things that you've probably internalized, and let's like really work out whether they're doing you any good, instead of framing it as like, this is bad. More like, do you like this? Like, is this fun for you? It's probably not. But what about the stuff that is fun for you? What do you value? And starting to pull apart, what are the valuable, good communal parts of who I am as a man that I like, that I think are good? And what are the parts that are doing me harm? And then having that be a conversation they have with other men. Because at the end of the day, like, it's the person in charge who has to stop being shitty. Like, you can make the arguments and show, but people have to commit. Like at that tier, cis men definitely have to commit to that cultural change and hold each other accountable. And I think modeling that practice is my like, here's how I think we get there. And I do think we're seeing more of it in terms of like the wife guy aesthetic being a thing, that it's like cool now in millennial spaces to love your wife, which is just a wild thing to have to say also, that wasn't a thing before, but it sure wasn't. And making that actually something that is positive. And it becomes like, yeah, this is the normal thing to do. Why are you doing that other thing? And like accepting those stages of interim progress. I think queerness helps in that. We can have some things we contribute to the world, but like middle-class cis white gay men sure aren't always doing a great job either in a lot of ways. So I think that focus on community and what can you do to work on yourself in relation to other people is my answer, is thinking about things as more relational, and that they can get something out of it, like that it can be pleasurable and positive. And it's not just a like, well, change who you are. It's like, no, find the good shit and do more of the good shit. Like, you can still play sports and like roughhouse. That's cool. Just ask your bro first. Just ask once and then we're good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's so. Is there anything that you've found in talking with students that they really resonate with when you say, like, let's talk about the good stuff or let's talk about the bad stuff? Is there anything that comes up again and again where you're like, huh?
Yes. So a really memorable one from the last term that I taught a gender and pop culture course was a young man who had been on a track team and had liked to shave his legs because it felt nice, and then got just relentlessly made fun of for shaving his legs and stopped, and then had a real breakthrough moment about beauty standards and masculinity in class and was like, I liked shaving my legs. Fuck those guys. I'm going to shave my legs again. I like to swim. And it was like a powerful moment for him. You know what I mean? Like, it was a personal journey and very intense for him in that moment. It's like, you're right, dude. Go shave your legs. Cool. But it seemed really minor, but it was one of those moments where you could see a switch flip almost of like, that was absurd that they did that to me. Like, what does that even matter? And that kind of thing. And another one who said his girlfriend came out to him as bi because she thought he had really learned something and was being more open. Like, that kind of stuff. That's a real positive.
Yeah,
like,
that's great.
Maybe girls will like you more if you like girls more. Like, for the straight boys, maybe if you like women, they'll like
maybe
you.
have some female friends, you know, like it's like, doesn't hurt, like
Yeah.
can really help. Okay, so we have a final question, which is a general question from Candace, the owner of Tubby and Coos, a fine bookstore where you should buy lots of books, not just our books, buy every book, just like all your books, all your holiday books, do it now. And they ask, what are we both working on next? So you start.
Okay. I do have that novella that I mentioned coming out. I think I did not say the title or anything else about it. It's Feed Them Silence. And it's about wolves and how we perform conservation as kind of an image or an idea. Like, we want to lock onto a cool animal that looks neat rather than looking at functional systemic problems. As much as I think wolves are awesome and cute, that is also part of the critique of self that is engaged in there. It's like, well, what about all the not cute animals? Like, what about rats? They matter
Love
a lot
rats.
to the ecosystem. I know. Worms, very important. Wasps, I don't like them, but they are important.
I think the jury's out on that one. I've never gotten a straight answer from anyone about what wasps do in the ecosystem.
I can hold on to that hope.
I think other animals eat their eggs, and that can be helpful. I mean, they're doing something. Come on.
Yes.
So that's coming out in 2023?
Early 2023. I think.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yes.
And then you have your disc that you're finishing up?
Still working on pretty actively.
Yeah.
You know, give that another year. So
yeah.
We'll see.
So is that going to come out from University of Kentucky Press, perhaps?
Well, one can hope, that it will be from somewhere. Because
exactly. Whisper in the ear of academic presses. Hello.
We know this is happening.
Cool.
What about you?
So as I mentioned earlier, I'm in the middle of revisions on a new novel, which is coming out also in early 2023. So maybe we'll see each other on tour. That'd be cool. Maybe we'll actually be out in the world on tour. It's called The Terraformers, and it's a multi-generational epic about a group of people who have been built by this real estate development company to create a terraformed world that's supposed to look like Pleistocene Earth. So it's like an artisanal heirloom planet kind of thing. And it's about their struggle to, basically see if they can actually set up a government on the planet, because it's a privately owned planet. All of the people on the planet are owned by the corporation. They were built by the corporation. And so one of the big questions of the book is, will they ever be able to exist outside corporate ownership? But also it's about how in this future, the entire environment is kind of alive. And so some of the main characters include a flying moose, and actually worms. There's naked mole rat characters. And in the final section, the main character is actually a flying train. And so it's kind of about how all of these different life forms fit into the ecosystem. And there's just a lot of, and there's of course robots, because it's an Annalee book. So yeah, it's I feel like you and I are both thinking about in the environment in our in our weird ways. Capital.
There's sure some science capital and in this one.
Yeah. Yeah. So and so I have that, and then I'm also working on another nonfiction book, which is coming out hopefully late in 2023, which is about it's sort of about moments of psychological warfare in U.S. history and how that's affecting our pop culture. And so it involves a lot of the stuff that you deal with in Summer Suns, actually, like a history of genocide and systemic class injustice and stuff like that. But also just fun propaganda.
Yeah. It's everywhere.
Yeah. And propaganda can be a good thing. Like you can have feminist propaganda. You can have, non-binary propaganda. This whole event, by the way, is brought to you by non-binary propaganda, I think. So
the queer agenda.
Yes, exactly. A subcategory of the dark academic non-binary agenda. We're like one of the bylaws or something. Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, thank you so much for letting me ask you a million questions. And thanks to Tubby and Coos for being amazing hosts.
Yes.
Thanks to all of you guys for coming out. All of you humans for coming out. And if there's any moose in the audience or worms or wolves, thanks to you for coming too. Maybe some sentient cars. That's sexy.
That's sexy. I did do the.
Oh man. One day, Lee, will you please just write a story about somebody falling in love with a car and like having sex with a car? That would be really nice of you.
This sounds like a Chuck Tingle story.
No, I want it to be a Lee story. There's the Chuck Tingle version, and then there's the Lee version, which would be super different.
Just really go hard on it.
More than one.
Oh, there's definitely room for more than one.
Anyway, that's my request.
That's a worthy request.
Yeah, someday, when you're in your copious free time.
I love our bullet point on the queer agenda. Like, non-binary propaganda, this event. Like,
subcategory C, like bylaw 10.
Chubby and Coons could just be there as a whole, really.
Yeah.
But thank y'all so much. I'm going to plug People Buying Books too, because that's what we want you all to do, is to buy books. So this is Summer Suns, which has a real creepy cover, and I love it so much, Lee.
The artist did great. Yeah, I love it.
Very cool. And so just if you don't want to buy it after this conversation, now that you see the cover, maybe you will. So you can purchase this book and also Annalee's books. This is actually the hardcover version of Future of Another Timeline. The paperback looks different, but it's still just as good either way. And Four Lost Cities is a nonfiction book that is, I think, your most recent. Is that correct? Is that
that came out just this year.
Cool. So yes, all the books, please buy them. You can go to chubbyandcoos.com/special order and get any and all books that you want. Like Annalee said, for the holidays, like whatever, just order your books, and that would be wonderful. And thank you, Annalee, and thank you, Lee. This was amazing. I really loved this conversation, especially being a person of the South and in the South and born and from the South. I really appreciated all of that. So thank you both so much. I love you both, and I'm so excited that y'all did this with me. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Get reading.